They say you never really own your land. You just borrow it from the future. But I learned the hard way what happens when someone decides your future isn't yours anymore. When I first saw the survey flags scattered across the edge of my property, I didn't think much of it. Bright orange markers poking through the tall grass, lined up neatly in a grid that didn't belong. I thought maybe the county was running new cables or marking for maintenance. But a week later, I woke up to the growl of diesel engines, heavy, rumbling, confident, the kind of sound that says, "We're here to stay." That morning, I stood in my driveway watching trucks roll in, one after another like an army, bulldozers carving deep lines into the earth, men in reflective vests pacing across my land, waving blueprints and shouting coordinates. No one looked at me. No one cared. They acted as if I was invisible, like the man who actually owned this dirt didn't exist. By noon, the first trees were down. By sunset, I could see the skeleton of something new rising from the ground. A wall, a gate, a sign that would later read, Whispering Pines Estates, a proud HOA community. That's when the truth began to sink in. They weren't just building near my property, they were building on it. At first, I was confused more than angry. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the city had redrawn a boundary line without notice. I called the county office, sent emails, even drove to the developer's on-site trailer. The site manager looked me in the eye, smiled, and told me it was all taken care of. When I asked what that meant, he shrugged and said, "Don't worry about it, sir. The HOA handles everything." That's when the word HOA first entered my nightmare. Over the next few weeks, construction spread like wildfire. Concrete foundations poured, framing rose, roofing teams moved in. It was relentless. My quiet corner of land became a full-scale development overnight. The hum of machinery never stopped. At night, the distant clanging of steel echoed through my windows like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I filed complaints, I called lawyers, I even tried to put up a fence to mark my property line. They tore it down within a day. The HOA sent me a letter claiming I was interfering with authorized construction. Authorized. On my land. That's when I realized they weren't confused. They knew exactly what they were doing. The more I looked, the worse it got. Their building plans overlapped with my property deeds by almost 10 acres. 10 acres I'd inherited from my father, who'd spent his life paying taxes and keeping that land free of debt, liens, and disputes. It was supposed to be my security, my family's legacy. And now it was being eaten alive by an HOA that didn't even acknowledge my existence. Friends told me to fight back, to get angry, to sue, to protest. But I didn't. I stayed silent. I let them build. I let them pave the roads, put up the streetlights, plant the flowers, and sell the homes. I watched as families moved in, as mailboxes were numbered, as property values rose. Every nail they hammered, every brick they laid, I kept records, dates, photos, copies of deeds, measurements, all of it. Because while they thought they were building their dream community, I was quietly building something else. A case. And when the last house was finished, when the last family unpacked their boxes and settled in, I finally made my move. I still remember the silence that followed, the way the HOA president's smile faded when he read the first page of my claim, the way the color drained from the developer's face when my lawyer explained exactly whose land their entire subdivision was sitting on. They built 98 homes on land that didn't belong to them, and I let them do it. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't stopping someone, it's letting them walk straight into their own trap. So here's my question for you. What would you do if an entire neighborhood was built on your land and no one believed you owned it? For most of my life, that land wasn't just dirt. It was memory.
A stretch of open fields tucked behind an old tree line, quiet and steady, just outside the city limits. I grew up walking it every morning with my father before school, our boots leaving soft prints in the dew-covered grass. He'd stop sometimes to point out where the sun hit the ground first. "That's where the soil's richest," he'd say. And I'd listen, not realizing how deeply those words would root themselves in me. When he passed, the land came to me. 10 acres, not much by some standards, but enough to feel like something worth protecting. It wasn't fenced in, not formally marked, just open and peaceful, the kind of place you could breathe. After the funeral, I used to drive out there on weekends with my coffee and just sit by the oak tree near the center. It became my quiet ritual. No noise, no neighbors, just wind and memory. I had always thought someday I'd build something there. Maybe a workshop, maybe a small house for retirement, but there was no rush. Some places are better left untouched for a while. The land sat just beyond a growing neighborhood called Whispering Pines, a development that had started as a few houses and quickly turned into hundreds. It had the look of one of those planned communities, manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, the same color palette of beige, white, and gray, the kind of place where the rules were written in a binder thicker than a phone book. At first, I didn't mind. The HOA had their boundaries, and I had mine. I figured if they wanted to police fence heights and mailbox colors, that was their business. But there was something about the way that neighborhood kept expanding, creeping closer year after year, that felt unsettling. It started small. A new street sign went up farther down the road than it used to be. Then, one morning, a crew was out trimming trees along my property line. When I asked what they were doing, one of the workers just said, "Community maintenance, sir," and kept going. I didn't think much of it until they cut down a sapling I'd planted with my father years ago. That's when the feeling changed. The thing about HOAs and developers is that they move quietly at first. You don't notice the encroachment until it's too late. A few feet here, a few survey stakes there, and suddenly your space feels smaller. I remember walking the boundary one afternoon with an old plat map in my hands, realizing one of their new walking trails had edged several feet onto my side. I took pictures, I made notes, but I still believed, maybe foolishly, that people would do the right thing if I just pointed it out. So I called, I emailed, I even attended one of their community meetings, sitting in a row of folding chairs while they talked about lawn fertilizer schedules and mailbox regulations. When I brought up the issue, a woman in a navy blue blazer, the HOA president, smiled politely and said they'd look into it. That was it. No urgency, no apology, just a smile that felt more like dismissal than reassurance. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing changed except for the sound. Every morning, construction trucks began arriving earlier. Cement mixers replaced birdsong. The air smelled like wet concrete and diesel fuel. I drive out to my land and see fresh tire marks across the edge. And one day, there it was. A row of metal stakes driven into the ground, orange tape fluttering like warning flags. That was the first time I felt anger tighten my chest. I called the county office to verify boundaries, but the clerk sounded unsure. "It looks like there was a recent adjustment," she said. Adjustment. The kind of word bureaucracies use when they've made a mistake they don't want to admit. The next week, a developer sign appeared near my access road. "Future site of Whispering Pines Phase 3. Luxury living begins here." I stood there for a long time, staring at that sign, the wind snapping against it. Luxury living on land that had been in my family for 2 generations. Still, I told myself not to panic. Mistakes could be fixed, lines could be redrawn. I gathered my documents, the deed, tax records, even the original survey from my father's time, and brought them to a local attorney. He looked through everything carefully and finally said, "You've got solid ownership here. No liens, no easements. But if they've started construction, things might get complicated." Complicated. Another one of those words that sounds small but means disaster. When I drove back that afternoon, a grader was already pushing soil across the first few yards of my property. The ground that once grew wildflowers and soft clover was being flattened under steel and wheels. I waved down the site foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a clipboard, and told him they were working on private land. He barely looked up. "Not according to my plans," he said. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about my father, about how proud he was of that land, how he used to say, "If you take care of the earth, it'll take care of you." And now the same earth was being stolen right out under me, not by strangers in the night, but by people in suits with contracts and confidence. Over the next few weeks, I watched as the transformation accelerated. Roads were paved where there used to be trails, wooden stakes became concrete curbs, the fields turned into lots, and the lots turned into houses. 98 of them. From a distance, it almost looked beautiful. Uniform rooftops glinting in the sun, perfectly aligned driveways, families touring their new dream homes. But every time I looked closer, all I saw was theft disguised as progress. Neighbors started appearing too, friendly faces who waved at me like I was one of them. They didn't know their homes stood on stolen ground. They didn't know that beneath those driveways were the roots of trees I once planted with my father. At first, I wanted to tell them, to warn them, but something in me stopped me. I realized that these weren't my enemies. They were just caught in the web, same as I was. The real enemy was the system that allowed this to happen. The HOA, the developers, the ones who thought paperwork could erase ownership, that money and connections could redraw boundaries. Every day the noise grew louder. Every week another letter arrived, fines for unauthorized activity, notices about construction interference, demands for compliance. Compliance. They were fining me for stepping onto my own land. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Up until then, I'd been patient. I'd believed in fairness, in reason, in the idea that right and wrong still meant something. But the letters, the smirks, the silence, it all taught me the same lesson. These people only understood power. And I didn't have to shout to use it. So I stopped arguing. I stopped calling. I stopped showing up to their meetings. I let them believe I was defeated, that I'd given up, that they'd won. All the while, I was gathering everything. Every map, every invoice, every recorded deed. I tracked construction permits, copied sales records, even photographed property listings. My lawyer told me to keep quiet. He said, "Let them hang themselves with their own rope." So I did. From that point on, I became a ghost in my own land. I watched from the sidelines as they built their world, the street signs, the fences, the playgrounds. I heard the laughter of kids playing where my father once walked. It hurt, but I waited. Because I knew that every nail they drove, every foundation they poured, was one step closer to their downfall. And when it was finally done, when the last moving truck pulled away and the HOA sent out their glossy newsletters bragging about their thriving new community, I was ready. They thought the silence meant surrender, but I was just giving them time to finish my evidence. Because in a world that runs on greed and arrogance, sometimes the smartest move isn't to fight back immediately. Sometimes the real power lies in patience. You never really understand how quiet peace is until it's gone. Once the construction stopped, I thought maybe the chaos would finally fade. The machines were gone, the workers had moved on. For the first time in months, I could hear the wind again, the kind that used to run soft through the grass and over the fields. But that peace didn't last long, because the moment the neighborhood was finished, the letters started coming. At first, I thought they were routine mailings, welcome packets, maybe advertisements from the new Homeowners Association. But when I opened the first envelope, my chest tightened.
It was a notice of violation from the Whispering Pines HOA board, accusing me of unauthorized storage of equipment on community property. Community property. They were talking about my shed, a small wooden shed my father and I built 20 years ago, sitting right where it always had, on the edge of my land. Now, they claimed it belonged to them. I crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. I thought it was a clerical mistake, another line-crossing mix-up. But then came a second letter, and a third, each one more aggressive than the last, demanding I remove all unapproved structures and comply with HOA's landscaping standards. It didn't make sense. I wasn't a member of their HOA. I'd never signed anything, never agreed to their rules, never even lived inside their community boundaries. But to them, I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was inside the line, whether I liked it or not. And that's when the harassment really began. One morning I drove out to check the property and found a man in a reflective vest stapling a laminated notice to my fence post. It read, "Final warning, non-compliant lot." He didn't even look at me when I asked what he was doing. He just said, "Talk to the HOA, sir," and walked away. I tore the sign down, but the next day, another appeared. Then another. Soon I wasn't just getting letters, I was getting fines. $250 for landscaping violations, $500 for unauthorized signage, $1,000 for failure to respond to prior notices. It was absurd. I called the HOA office, but the woman on the phone said my property was part of the extended Whispering Pines subdivision and subject to the governing covenants. When I told her I never agreed to any covenants, she simply said, "Sir, that's something you'll need to dispute in writing." Dispute in writing. Another polite way of saying, "Good luck fighting us." Every week the pressure mounted. Residents from the new home started treating me like I was the problem, the one holding up progress. I'd catch people slowing their cars when they passed, whispering as they looked at my old shed and the open land around it. Some even parked near my property line to take pictures, like I was an exhibit. The final straw came when I discovered a group of HOA board members had walked onto my land without permission to inspect violations. They left footprints across the wet soil and flagged problem areas with little pink ribbons. I remember standing there, watching those ribbons flutter in the breeze, thinking, they're not just trespassing, they're testing me. That night, I barely slept. I sat at my desk, surrounded by letters, notices, and photos. The anger was sharp, but beneath it was something colder, determination. They wanted me to lash out, to fight publicly, to lose control, but I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, I began documenting everything. I created folders, labeled and dated, for every interaction, every notice, every act of harassment. I took photos of the signs, recorded videos of the trespassers, saved every email. My lawyer told me they're building their own case against themselves. Just let them keep talking.
And that's exactly what I did. But the HOA wasn't finished. A few weeks later, I arrived at the property and found something new. A small wooden post hammered into the ground with a plastic plaque on top. It read, "Lot number 47, sold." Lot 47. I stared at it for a long time. That lot was the same section of my land where my father's oak tree stood, the one place I used to sit every Sunday morning. They had sold it. That's when something inside me broke. I drove straight to the HOA office, a clean, glass-fronted building with neatly trimmed hedges and a big stone sign out front. Inside, the air smelled like new paint and coffee. I asked to speak to the president, the same woman who'd once smiled at me and promised to look into it. She came out all smiles again, her voice syrupy sweet. "Oh, Mr. Carter, what brings you in today?" I told her. Straight, calm, direct. "You're building on my land." Her smile didn't falter. She just tilted her head and said, "According to our records, your property falls under the Whispering Pines boundary expansion approved last year." "Approved by who?" I asked. "The county, and of course our legal team confirmed all acquisitions were valid." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "You don't own my land," I said quietly. She glanced at her watch. "If you believe there's an error, you're welcome to file a complaint. We take all community concerns seriously." Then she smiled again, that same cold, knowing smile, and walked away. That night, as I sat in my truck parked by the edge of the property, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight them on their terms anymore. No angry calls, no useless complaints. I would let them keep digging their own hole, deeper, wider, until they couldn't climb out. Over the next few months, construction finished on all 98 homes. The HOA held a ribbon-cutting ceremony, complete with local news coverage and a big photo op of the board standing in front of their new sign. I watched from a distance, camera in hand, documenting every smiling face, every handshake, every moment of celebration. They had no idea that the very ground beneath their feet, the land they were celebrating, legally belonged to me. But as the community grew, so did the tension. Some of the new homeowners started getting letters too. Small fines for things like leaving trash cans out or painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue. Whispers spread that the HOA was overstepping. People were frustrated, scared to speak up. One man approached me while I was walking near the property line. He said quietly, "You're not part of this HOA, are you? You're lucky." I almost laughed. Lucky. He told me he'd been fined 3 times in 1 month for things that weren't even in the bylaws. His neighbor had been threatened with a lien for a non-compliant mailbox. It was all about control. That's when it hit me. They didn't just steal land. They built an empire of fear. Every meeting, every fine, every rule was about power. And now, they thought that power made them untouchable. So I stayed quiet, watching, collecting. When the first legal notice arrived, a demand from the HOA that I cease all unauthorized presence on what they called community common grounds, I smiled. They were practically handing me evidence. My lawyer laughed when I showed him. They're citing property they don't even own. This is gold. But the pressure didn't stop. Soon the HOA escalated again, threatening to place a lien on my lot. That was the moment I knew they were finished, because to file a lien, they had to claim ownership. And to claim ownership, they had to submit legal proof, which meant, for the first time, their entire paper trail would come under scrutiny. And that's exactly what I'd been waiting for. For nearly a year, I'd been patient, gathering documents, survey maps, and title histories. My lawyer and I built a wall of evidence so strong it could crush any legal argument they had. We even found internal memos showing the developer had assumed boundary extensions pending approval, which never actually came. They built on assumptions. They built on arrogance. And soon, they'd realize they built on my land.
Still, I didn't strike yet. I let them keep sending their letters, let them keep harassing me. Because every new threat they sent, every false claim they made, became another nail in their own coffin. And when their annual HOA meeting came around, the one where they boasted about community growth and new property values, I was ready. They didn't know I'd filed my claim 2 days earlier. They didn't know a court order was already in motion. They didn't know that within weeks, every single one of those 98 homes would be sitting on land legally registered in my name. The silence before the storm is always the longest. And as I stood on the edge of my property that evening, watching porch lights flicker on across the new subdivision, I couldn't help but think, every one of those homes, Every manicured lawn, every happy family, all of it existed on borrowed ground. My ground. They thought they'd buried me under paperwork, but all they'd really done was plant the seeds of their own destruction. And soon, those seeds were going to bloom. In court. Because the thing about power is, it always overreaches. And when it does, it forgets that the quietest man in the room might just be the one holding the deed. I'll never forget the sound of that morning, the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. The HOA's annual meeting was set for a Thursday evening, 6 p.m. sharp, the kind of event they held every year, full of polite smiles and power in plastic chairs. They'd booked the local community hall, same as always, a stage, a microphone, a big projector screen with the HOA logo spinning in slow self-importance. For weeks, they'd advertised it. Join us as we celebrate another successful year of growth in Whispering Pines. Flyers in mailboxes, posts on community Facebook pages, a promise of refreshments and important community updates. I knew exactly what they were planning to brag about. Property values up 18%, new amenities approved, 98 homes sold, 98 dreams built, all on my land. And that's what made it poetic, because that same week, the court had issued its decision, quietly, legally, completely in my favor. It wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no surprise witness, just a judgment filed in the county clerk's office, a ruling that confirmed every square inch of Phase 3 of Whispering Pines was still registered under my name. The HOA, the developer, the real estate agents, every one of them had built an empire on property they never owned. The ink was barely dry when my lawyer looked at me and said, "You realized what this means, right?" I nodded. Yeah, I own them all. 98 homes, 98 families, 98 reminders that sometimes patience is the sharpest weapon of all. But I didn't want money, not yet. I didn't want a quiet settlement. They'd spent a year treating me like a nuisance, a trespasser, a problem to be ignored. So I decided to do what they'd never expect. I decided to show up. When I arrived, the parking lot was full. Rows of SUVs and sedans gleamed under the streetlights. I could hear the faint murmur of conversation from inside, laughter, clinking cups, the hollow confidence of people who think they're untouchable. I walked in through the back door. Nobody noticed me at first. I looked like anyone else. Jeans, jacket, a folder tucked under my arm. The HOA president stood at the podium, smiling wide. Her voice carried that practiced charm that only comes from people who love the sound of control. "We're proud to announce," she said, "that Whispering Pines continues to be one of the most desirable communities in the county." Applause filled the room. I waited, quiet, calm, watching. They moved on to new topics: landscaping budgets, enforcement updates, architectural guidelines. Every word was a reminder of how they'd buried themselves in bureaucracy, convinced that fine print could justify theft.
Then came the part I'd been waiting for. "Before we close," the president said, "we'd like to remind residents that ongoing disputes over lot boundaries have been resolved. The county has confirmed that all property lines are final. There's no cause for concern." I smiled, because that was a lie, and the truth was sitting in the folder under my arm. I waited until she finished her sentence. Then I stood. The room went still. A few people turned to look. Maybe they recognized me, maybe not. "Actually," I said, my voice steady, "that's not true." The president froze. "Excuse me?" I stepped forward, holding up the folder. "You said the county confirmed your property lines. That's incorrect. The county confirmed something else." The murmur started immediately. Dozens of faces turned toward me, whispers spreading like fire. I opened the folder, pulled out the first document, the official court ruling, stamped and signed. I held it up so everyone could see the seal. "This," I said, "is the judgment entered 3 days ago.
It confirms that every home in Phase 3, from Lot 1 through Lot 98, sits on land that legally belongs to me. Gasps, confusion. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else said, "What's he talking about?" The president's smile vanished. "Sir, this isn't an appropriate forum. It's the perfect forum. Because for the past year, your HOA has fined me, threatened me, and trespassed on my property. Property you never owned. And every notice you sent, every dollar you collected, every signature on every sale was fraud." The room erupted. Homeowners started talking over each other, voices rising, questions firing like bullets. "What does he mean? Is this true? Our homes? Fraud?" I watched the color drain from her face. She tried to regain control, tapping the mic. "Everyone, please, let's remain calm." But calm was gone. One man stood up near the front. "Wait, are you saying our deeds aren't valid?" I met his eyes. "Your deeds list the wrong grantor. The developer sold land he didn't own, which means the sales were never legal." Someone shouted, "That can't be right!" Another voice, "We paid our mortgages!" A woman gasped, "Oh my God!" And just like that, the HOA's empire began to crumble, not in a courtroom, not behind closed doors, but right there in front of the very people they'd manipulated. The president's voice cracked. "You can't just walk in here and make accusations." "I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts." I handed the papers to a man sitting near the front, the HOA's treasurer, judging by his name tag. "See for yourself. County Clerk's Office, case number 4721B, filed last week." He took it, scanning the pages. His eyes widened. He looked up slowly. This has the judge's signature." The president reached for the papers, but he pulled them away. "Is this real?" he asked her. She didn't answer. The room turned on her. Voices rose. "You said this was settled. You told us everything was fine. We bought these homes based on your assurances." She stammered, her voice trembling now. We were told everything was in order." "By who?" someone demanded. "The developer?" That name alone was enough, because everyone in that room knew the developer, the company that had promised luxury living, that had hosted open houses and barbecue events to lure buyers in. The same company that had bulldozed my father's land and turned it into profit. And now, their perfect neighborhood was about to become a legal wasteland. I let the chaos swell. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just stood there, letting the truth echo louder than anything I could have said. When the shouting finally slowed, I spoke again. "I gave you a year," I said quietly. "A year to fix what you broke. You ignored me. You buried me in fines, in lies, in paperwork. So I did what you didn't. I followed the law." The president sank into her chair. Her face was pale, eyes glassy. I turned to the crowd. "Now every one of you deserves to know what happens next. You won't lose your homes. I'm not here to punish families. But your HOA, your developer, they'll pay. Because this land was never theirs to sell. And soon every court in this county will know it." You could have heard a pin drop. Then slowly the murmurs returned. Not angry this time, but stunned. People whispering, shaking their heads, scrolling on their phones. One man in the back said, "He's right. It's already on the court website." A wave of gasps followed. Someone cursed under their breath. The truth was spreading faster than fear. And that's when it hit me. The moment I'd been waiting for. The shift. The look in their eyes when realization set in. For months, I'd been the outsider, the nuisance, the man they thought they could push aside. But now, I was the one thing they couldn't ignore. The owner. The president finally looked up at me, her voice small. "What are you going to do?" I met her gaze. Exactly what you did to me, I said. Follow the rules. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours, word spread across the county. News outlets picked it up. Homeowner wins legal battle against HOA. Developer built on wrong land. Entire neighborhood in legal limbo. My phone lit up non-stop. Journalists, lawyers, even other HOA victims from across the state reaching out to tell me their stories. But the best part, the part that still feels surreal, came a week later. The county posted a notice officially transferring ownership of all 98 parcels back under my name. It was public record, right there for anyone to see. Whispering Pines Phase 3. Owner, Daniel Carter. The HOA's website went down the same day. The developer's office temporarily closed. Homeowners started calling emergency meetings. The board resigned in waves. The president disappeared from social media entirely. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I drove out to the land one last time. The same road I'd driven since I was a kid. The same place where I'd walked with my father. Only now, there were houses instead of fields. Children played in the yards. Sprinklers hissed. Wind moved through the leaves of the one surviving oak tree. A few residents came out when they saw me. They didn't yell. They didn't accuse. They just looked uncertain. One man approached quietly. "Is it true? You own all of this?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's true." He hesitated, then said, "What happens to us?" I looked at the houses, the lives built on top of my pain, and said, "Nothing. You stay, you live, but you'll do it right this time. No lies, no HOA, no one threatening to take what isn't theirs." He stared for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. That was enough. Because this was never about revenge for the sake of it. It was about respect for my father, for the land, for every person who's ever been told they're powerless against money and paperwork. When I got back to my truck, I took one last look at the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, peaceful again. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Later that night, as the sun went down, I got an email from my lawyer. Subject line, "Settlement offer received." I opened it. The developer was offering a 7-figure payout to formally purchase the land they'd already built on, plus a full public apology and coverage of all legal fees. I stared at the number. It was enough to retire on, enough to rebuild anything I wanted. But more than that, it was proof, undeniable, permanent, that they'd finally admitted what they'd done. I hit reply and typed 3 words. Make it public. Because silence had been their weapon, and truth would be mine. The next morning, the headline hit every local feed. Homeowner legally owns entire subdivision after HOA overreach, developer forced to settle. Beneath it, a photo of the community sign, Whispering Pines Estates, with a new plaque added underneath. It read simply, "Property of Daniel Carter." People still ask me why I let them finish building, why I didn't stop them sooner. And I tell them the same thing every time. Because stopping them would have just been revenge. But letting them finish? That was justice. For weeks after the verdict, Whispering Pines felt like a place holding its breath. The lawns stayed trimmed, the mailboxes stood in perfect rows, but the conversations changed. Neighbors who used to trade gossip about HOA rules now spoke in softer voices, about ownership, responsibility, and what it meant to live on borrowed ground. Daniel drove those same streets every evening, not as a trespasser anymore, but as the rightful owner of every driveway, every sidewalk, every parcel that had once been taken from him. Yet victory didn't feel loud. It felt quiet, heavy.
like standing at the end of a storm and realizing the damage ran deeper than broken fences. The first letters arrived 2 weeks later. Apologies, written in trembling handwriting. Some were simple. We didn't know. Others were long confessional stories about how the HOA had pressured them, how fear of fines kept them silent when Daniel tried to warn them. He read each one carefully, never answering in anger. Instead, he made a decision that would define the next chapter. He wouldn't destroy the community that had grown from his family's land. He would rebuild it the right way. He met with a small group of residents at the old community hall, the same room where truth had finally broken through. There were no microphones this time, no podiums, no HOA logos spinning on screens, just folding chairs, tired faces, and the raw question that hung in the air: what happens now? Daniel placed a stack of documents on the table, new agreements drafted by his lawyer. They weren't deeds or contracts in the traditional sense. They were partnerships. Each homeowner would have a chance to repurchase their property directly from him at fair market value, free from HOA control. Payment plans were flexible, no penalties, no hidden clauses. For those struggling, he offered long-term leases until they could afford to buy. He said, "You've already built your lives here. Let's make sure you can keep them honestly this time." The reaction stunned him. Some cried outright. Others simply nodded, relief washing over them. The man who had once been the enemy was now the reason they could sleep again. But not everyone wanted peace. A handful of former HOA loyalists tried to fight back. Letters from lawyers, accusations of coercion, even a small protest claiming Daniel was monopolizing private property. It didn't last long. The county record spoke louder than slogans, and the same news outlets that had once ignored his pleas now reported every desperate attempt to discredit him. Within a month, opposition faded into silence. By the third month, Whispering Pines looked different. The HOA sign was gone. The security booth, once used to track residents and issue fines, now served as a community garden shed. Families planted tomatoes and herbs where lists of violations once hung. The sound of children playing replaced the constant tension of surveillance. Daniel didn't need to walk around checking rules anymore. People simply respected the land because they finally understood what it cost to lose it. And in that quiet transformation lay the real victory. Not the settlement money, not the headlines, but the return of something far more fragile: trust.
In the weeks that followed, the silence that once hung over Whispering Pines was replaced by something new, a nervous hum that spread from mailbox to mailbox. The residents had lived through an earthquake of truth, and the aftershocks were only beginning. The first tremor hit the developer. Their glossy billboards vanished overnight, replaced by blank panels where the company name had been scraped off. Offices that once boasted luxury living experts now displayed a single printed notice on the glass door: temporarily closed for audit. It wasn't temporary. Within 10 days, the corporation filed for Chapter 11 protection. Court documents revealed a tangle of forged signatures, backdated permits, and silent partners who had all quietly disappeared the moment Daniel's judgment went public. The HOA board dissolved just as quickly. 3 members resigned within 24 hours of the ruling. 2 others stopped answering calls. When journalists tried to reach them, their statements were short and shaky. "We relied on information provided by the developer." But the residents were done believing half-truths. Class action notices began circulating, homeowners suing the very HOA that had once ruled their lives. Daniel watched it unfold from a distance, sitting on his porch with a mug of black coffee. He didn't need to lift a finger. The machine that had bullied him was tearing itself apart. Then came the county hearings. Officials who had rubber-stamped the subdivision now faced public questioning. Red-faced administrators admitted they'd missed certain filings. The planning director resigned mid-meeting. Local reporters called it the most expensive oversight in county history. Through it all, Daniel stayed quiet. He had promised himself that revenge would never turn into gloating.
Justice had already spoken. The rest was simply echoes. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore: the homeowners caught in the middle. Mortgage companies were panicking, unsure who legally held collateral on houses built over the wrong deeds. Families feared eviction despite Daniel's earlier assurances. The uncertainty became a fog over the neighborhood. So Daniel acted. He instructed his lawyer to send a certified statement to every bank involved. All current occupants have permission to remain. No property may be foreclosed or seized pending new contracts. That single letter stopped a dozen foreclosure notices. Word spread fast. The man who owned the land was protecting the people on it. Gradually, hostility gave way to gratitude. Former HOA enforcers who once fined him for unapproved fencing now came to thank him for saving their mortgages. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Still, the weight of victory pressed hard. Reporters hounded him for interviews. Legal firms offered to turn his story into a national campaign. He declined them all. "This isn't about headlines," he told his lawyer. "It's about setting things right." Behind the scenes, another storm brewed. Insurance investigators uncovered that the developer's parent company had quietly insured the subdivision twice, once under its own name and once under a shell corporation. The revelation triggered federal attention. When the subpoenas arrived, the remaining executives vanished overseas. The FBI confirmed an investigation. The county used Daniel's case as the reason to rewrite its zoning regulations, introducing what locals soon nicknamed the Carter Clause. It required developers to present clear, verifiable title ownership before any construction permit could be approved. For the first time in decades, landowners felt protected again. And Whispering Pines, once a symbol of greed, became a classroom for change. Law schools analyzed the case. Real estate associations cited it in seminars. News anchors summarized it in one line: a man who waited in silence until the law itself spoke for him. But inside the neighborhood, the transformation was more human than legal. Neighbors began speaking to each other again, not through HOA notices, but across fences. Kids played without parents worrying about regulation violations. The community realized how much peace had been traded for control.
One evening, Daniel stood by the oak tree at the center of the cul-de-sac, the one piece of his father's land that had survived every bulldozer. Someone had tied a ribbon around it with a note that read, "Thank you for giving our homes back." He touched the bark and smiled. The fight had taken years, but in that moment, it finally felt over. Spring arrived quietly that year. The rain came soft and steady, rinsing the dust of lawsuits and broken trust from the roofs of Whispering Pines. For the first time in months, the neighborhood smelled like cut grass instead of fear. The HOA was gone, its office cleared out, its records boxed and sealed in the county archive. But the people who had lived beneath its shadow remained. Families still needed somewhere to meet, to talk, to decide what came next. Daniel understood that if the vacuum left by power wasn't filled with cooperation, old habits would creep back. He rented the small hall on Elm Street, the same one where the reckoning had begun. No banners, no rules taped to the door, just a handwritten sign that read, "Community Meeting, Everyone Welcome." They came slowly at first. Couples clutching folders, parents balancing toddlers on their hips, retirees curious but cautious. Daniel didn't stand at a podium, he sat in the same folding chair as everyone else. When the room filled, he stood and spoke the simplest words of his life. "We can rebuild this place together, or we can let the same fear that ruined it define us again." Silence held for a long breath, and then a woman near the back said, "Tell us what that looks like." So he did. He unrolled a sheet of paper across the table, an idea drafted with his lawyer and a few sympathetic residents. Instead of an HOA, they would form a cooperative, a voluntary council open to any homeowner, one vote per household, transparent accounts posted online, No fines. No power to dictate paint colors or mailbox heights. Its only duty would be maintenance of shared spaces, the park, the lights, the walking path, and every decision would require open consent. At first, the proposal seemed impossible. They'd all grown used to being ruled by threat. But the more Daniel explained, the clearer it became that what they'd mistaken for order had really been control. Questions turned into plans. Who would handle budgets? How would disputes be settled? Daniel smiled as strangers began answering each other instead of looking to him. By the time the meeting ended, 10 volunteers had signed up to draft the new charter. The next morning, children chalked rainbows across the cul-de-sac while their parents painted over the old HOA parking permit numbers. The transformation wasn't loud, it was steady, one small act of ownership at a time. Weeks passed. The co-op meetings moved outdoors, under the oak tree that had outlived every battle. Folding tables replaced podiums, and potluck dishes replaced catered spreads. When disagreements arose over landscaping budgets or where to build a new playground, they were met with conversation instead of citations. The security booth at the entrance, once manned by watchful guards, was repurposed as a tool shed. Residents painted it white and stenciled the garden box on the side. Every Saturday, families dropped off spare seeds and gardening tools. In time, the barren median that had symbolized HOA perfection burst into wild color. For Daniel, rebuilding wasn't just about structure. It was about healing memory. He hired local carpenters to reconstruct the old Carter barn, a weather-worn outbuilding that had stood on his father's original acreage before the bulldozers came. The barn became a community center, its walls lined with photographs of the land before, rolling fields, his father smiling beside that same oak tree. It was both a museum and a reminder of what silence could protect when used with purpose. Not everyone adapted easily. A handful of residents missed the rigidity. They said the neighborhood felt too loose, that without rules it might slip into chaos. Daniel listened without judgment and pointed to the laughter echoing from the new playground. "That's order," he said quietly. "It just sounds different now." By summer, the local paper returned to write a follow-up story. The headline read, "Whispering Pines Blooms Again, From Control to Community." Photographs showed families tending gardens, repairing fences together, children painting signs that read, "Be kind, not in charge." Donations began pouring in, hardware stores offering supplies, civic groups lending volunteers. What had started as scandal became inspiration. Other subdivisions sent letters asking how they could form their own cooperatives. Daniel's lawyer joked that they should publish a manual. Daniel just laughed. "No," he said, "they just need to start talking to each other." Through it all, Daniel remained deliberate about one thing: humility. His name was on every deed, but he refused to act like an owner. When residents tried to dedicate a street to him, he declined. "Name it after the tree," he suggested instead. "It's been here longer than any of us." And so they did. Oak Circle, a simple name for a simple truth. Roots matter. As the first year without an HOA ended, Whispering Pines looked nothing like the manicured brochure that had once sold it. Lawns grew wild with wildflowers, mailboxes carried hand-painted patterns, and neighbors waved without glancing over their shoulders. The place breathed again. One evening, as dusk turned the sky copper, Daniel locked the door of the restored barn after another cooperative meeting. A faint breeze carried laughter from the playground and the smell of fresh soil. He looked up at the tree swaying against the fading light and felt something settle inside him. Not victory, not vengeance, just peace. Autumn crept in quietly, the way forgiveness sometimes does, slow, hesitant, unsure if it's really welcome. The oak leaves at Whispering Pines turned amber,
drifting onto driveways that no one bothered to sweep too quickly. Life had found its rhythm again, and for Daniel, that rhythm finally sounded like rest. He hadn't left town since the verdict. Every day brought a small reminder of what had been won and what had been lost. The cedar smell of the barn, the laughter from the playground, the weight of his father's pocket knife still in his jeans pocket. But one place remained untouched, the hillside cemetery where the fight had truly started. On a late October morning, he drove there alone. The road wound past harvested fields and a row of maples that flamed red against the gray sky. When he stepped out of the truck, the wind carried the dry rustle of corn stalks and a faint hum of the highway far below. His father's headstone sat beneath a crooked pine. The name was simple: Samuel Carter, 1946-2014. No epitaph, just the earth he had loved more than anything. Daniel knelt, brushed the fallen needles aside, and laid a folded copy of the court ruling at the base.
"It's done," he whispered. "They finally had to listen." He stayed there for a long time, saying nothing else. Words felt too small for years of anger, waiting, and the strange calm that followed victory. What he realized in that silence was that justice didn't erase loss, it only gave it a place to rest. When the wind shifted, he imagined his father's dry chuckle, the one that always came after hard labor and long patience. "Told you, son, land remembers who cares for it." The thought loosened something inside him. For the first time, the ache in his chest didn't burn, it simply existed, honest and bearable. He left a single acorn on the stone before walking back to the truck. The road home felt lighter. Back in Whispering Pines, people had stopped seeing Daniel as the man who owned everything. They saw him as the man who had given them another chance. Yet he still carried the solitude that comes after battle, the quiet that follows when purpose fades. He spent the winter rebuilding the small farmhouse his father had started decades ago, board by board. Neighbors volunteered, eager to help. They brought casseroles, lent power tools, painted shutters. What once would have been an ordered HOA project turned into weekends filled with laughter and muddy boots. Daniel accepted the help, but mostly he listened to stories, to confessions, to the simple sound of community mending itself. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk the property lines with a flashlight, tracing the boundaries he had fought so hard to defend. The beam caught frost glinting on fences and the glimmer of stars above the oak tree. He would stop, breathe the cold air, and whisper a quiet promise: never again. It wasn't a vow of vengeance, it was stewardship. The understanding that ownership meant protection, not control. That silence could serve peace as powerfully as it had served revenge. By spring, the farmhouse was finished. On the porch hung a wooden sign carved by a neighbor's teenage son: Carter Home, founded and returned 2000 and returned. The boy's wording felt right. The house had indeed been founded and returned, not just to him, but to what it represented. One afternoon, he invited the cooperative council over for coffee. They sat in rocking chairs, looking out at the fields where wildflowers had taken over the old construction site. Someone asked him what he planned to do next. He smiled, stirring his cup. "Nothing loud, just keep the ground honest." The phrase stuck. Within weeks, residents painted it on a mural beside the playground: "Keep the ground honest." It became the unspoken motto of the new Whispering Pines, an anchor reminding everyone that freedom without respect eventually repeats the past. That summer, Daniel finally allowed himself to rest. He traveled a little, visited old friends, even took a photography class at the community college. When he returned, he found a small crowd gathered at the barn. They had framed and hung one of his photographs, a shot of the oak tree bathed in sunrise with a caption underneath: "Patience isn't weakness. It's the quiet part of strength." He stood there for a long time, surrounded by the people who had once feared him, and realized that healing wasn't a single moment. It was a season that kept returning, softer each time.
By the time the second anniversary of the lawsuit came around, Whispering Pines was unrecognizable, not because of what had been built, but because of what had grown. The fences that once divided neighbors were lined with climbing roses. The boardroom that had once decided fates now served as a daycare. And the people who had once whispered complaints at HOA meetings now gathered freely in the open air, debating everything from gardening tips to how to keep coyotes off the trails. The story of Daniel Carter and the 98 homes had spread far beyond the county. Bloggers wrote about it as the quietest revolution in suburbia. Local colleges used it as a case study in land law. Even a few developers, those bold enough to admit they were listening, sent letters thanking him for proving that property rights didn't have to mean community loss. Yet Daniel never called himself a hero. He always said the same thing when reporters asked what drove him. I just stopped letting people take what wasn't theirs, and that included peace of mind. He still lived in the same farmhouse, still walked the same perimeter each morning. But now those walks weren't to check boundaries. They were to greet neighbors. He'd waved to families who waved back, children who shouted his name without fear, and old friends who met his eyes instead of lowering theirs. It was subtle, almost invisible, the way trust had returned to the soil. The following spring, a young couple moved into one of the smaller cottages, the first family to buy since the land titles had been returned. They knew the story, of course, everyone did. But what caught Daniel off guard was their question one evening at the co-op meeting. "Mr. Carter," the husband asked, "what's the one thing you wish people understood about all this?" Daniel paused, looking at the circle of faces lit by the soft yellow string lights under the barn rafters. He smiled slightly. "I just stopped letting people take what wasn't theirs, and that included peace of mind." The room went quiet, not with awe, but with understanding. For many of them, it was the first time someone had turned a legal victory into a moral lesson, and one that didn't feel forced. Within months, neighboring subdivisions began adopting similar cooperatives. One called theirs the Green Loop, another named theirs the Pact. Local officials noticed something remarkable. Complaint calls and petty disputes dropped by almost half. Without threats or fines, communities began fixing their own problems through dialogue. What Daniel had done out of necessity became a model for sustainable neighborhoods. A journalist from a national magazine came to interview him that summer. She wanted to photograph the oak tree, the same one that had witnessed every chapter. When she asked if he'd ever considered selling the story rights, he shook his head. "Some things lose their truth when you price them. I'd rather it stay a story people tell over dinner than a show they scroll past." The article went viral anyway. Its headline read, "The Man Who Outsmarted an HOA and Taught His Town to Breathe Again." But Daniel didn't chase the fame. He spent that weekend repairing a broken fence for an elderly neighbor, laughing when kids offered to supervise. Fame, he realized, wasn't the point. Peace was.
Years passed. The land settled into itself. Trees grew tall where bulldozers had once carved roads, and wildflowers spread across the edges of every lawn. What had once been a battlefield was now a mosaic of life. Daniel, older now, spent his mornings sitting on the porch with coffee, watching the sunrise pour through mist above the fields. Sometimes he would get letters, handwritten notes from strangers who had seen the video documentary someone else had made about Whispering Pines. They wrote about their own battles with HOAs, developers, or greedy councils. They always ended the same way. "Your story gave us courage." He answered every letter with the same 3 words: "Stand your ground." But he always meant more than land. He meant integrity, decency, patience, the kind that holds firm without turning bitter. One afternoon, he found a small parcel in the mail, a photograph of a new community center in another state. Beneath it, a message read, "Built in your honor."
Our HOA voted itself out last month." He laughed until tears blurred the print. That was legacy enough. On the 10th anniversary of the verdict, the cooperative held a gathering at the barn. Hundreds came, residents, former journalists, even the children who had grown up hearing the story whispered like legend. They unveiled a plaque beneath the oak tree that read, "May this land remind us that silence can protect, but voice can rebuild. Keep the ground honest." Daniel didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. When the crowd dispersed, he stayed back, touching the cool metal of the plaque. In that quiet moment, he thought of his father, of the fear, of the long nights alone with maps and court filings, and of how everything, somehow, had come full circle. The land was still his, but more importantly, it was theirs. He turned toward the setting sun, its light folding gold through the oak leaves, and exhaled a breath that seemed to carry every year of struggle away. "You were right, Dad. Land remembers who cares for it." Then he smiled, the kind of smile that comes only when a story doesn't need telling anymore, because everyone already knows how it ends. Sometimes revenge looks like justice, and justice looks like peace. But the truest victory isn't winning a case, it's rebuilding what power tried to destroy. If you've ever been pushed off your own ground, remember, patience isn't weakness, it's strength, waiting for its moment to grow roots. So tell me, what would you have done if 98 homes rose on your land? Would you fight, forgive, or find a way to build something better? Let me know in the comments below.